Had a major event in my life in the spring of 1962, May 29th, 4:05 in the afternoon at our farm. I was struck and killed by lightning.
Welcome back to the Talk Midland podcast. My name is Logan Richetti with Modern Realty. Today I have a new friend with me, Floyd Andrick from the Midland County Historical Society. 26 years on the council, never once missed a meeting.
Correct.
That's impressive.
Yes.
I can't wait for this conversation. But let's start with the crash of Flight 67, which is a booklet here that you just put together.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a release from the Midland County Historical Society.
Correct.
What was the crash of Flight 67?
Well, on April 6, 1958, a Capital Airlines Viscount passenger plane coming up from origined in Newark, New Jersey, flying up to Detroit, then on to Flint. And because of adverse weather that day, they had not planned to come on to Tri-City Airport. So people from this area that needed to get onto that flight with the final destination of Chicago that night drove to Flint to be sure to get on the plane. And in Flint, it was announced that weather has slightly improved, that the plane would come on to Tri-City, now MBS Airport. So the plane was making its flight up to MBS. Encountered turbulence, snow squalls, was making its landing approach at 11:19 p.m. And due to the winds, Captain Hull had to bank the plane about 55, 60 degrees. And it was only 34 degrees, half rain, half snow, ideal for icing. He was unaware the aircraft was icing up. And at 11:19, a witness on the ground heard the four engines of the plane go to full power. Apparently, Captain Hull realized his plane had stalled, and the plane nosed over at about 300 feet and crashed nose first into the ground, killed all 44 passengers and the 3 crew aboard. So that was the most major disaster in all of central Michigan for loss of life, before and since.
Wow. That's a pretty traumatic story. What drove you to put this book together to share it with Midland?
Well, I've always been interested in history, and I remember when this event happened, I was 11 years of age. And it happened on Easter Sunday night. Next morning at school, the teacher told us that a big plane had crashed the night before. Had killed a lot of people, including 8 people from Dow Chemical. So when I got home from school that afternoon, my brother-in-law said, "Hey kids, let's go see where that big plane crashed last night." So we drove over to Tri-City Airport. Of course, we couldn't go near the wreckage. But I remembered seeing the upside-down tail of the plane, and you could read the name Capital and Viscount. Wreckage was still smoking, and it's all everybody talked about for weeks. And it was such a big event that being a lover of history, I love to preserve history. So that was my inspiration to write this booklet.
Well, speaking of which, you go all the way back in Midland.
Yes.
You have a very interesting story, especially from the beginning. Take us through that.
Oh, my. Wow. Hard to compress 77 years into a few minutes. Well, I was born here in Midland Hospital, August 6, 1947. Delivered by Midland's baby doctor, Dr. Joseph Shirk. Charged my dad $25 for the delivery. And so 3 days later, began life at our family farm about 10 miles north of Midland. Farm goes back to 1893, settled by my grandfather, John Andrick, who had a sawmill and was very well known in the area. Had a good childhood, loved school. Started out at the two-room country school and walked 2 miles each way as a 5-year-old. Then eventually went on to Northeast Intermediate in Midland, and then transferred up to Sanford Meridian in 1962. Had a major event in my life in the spring of 1962, May 29th, 4:05 in the afternoon at our farm. I was struck and killed by lightning. I'm only here today because a family friend who was a medic in the Korean War knew how to do resuscitation. And from what I was told, he worked on me for about 10 minutes before I began breathing on my own. So that's the only reason I'm alive today, is due to his efforts. He said when he got to me, he knew I was dead. He said I was blue-white smoke coming off me. Couldn't detect a heartbeat or breathing. So,
Holy moly.
yeah, it was quite an experience, one that, of course, I'll never forget that time and date. I had some minor injuries. I had some burns, had some heart damage, which fortunately I outgrew. But at home, I still have the watch that was fried at 4:05 that afternoon, where I had metal on me, like rivets in my jeans. I had burn marks. But, yeah, quite an experience.
Do you remember it?
Very well.
You do?
Oh, yes.
How would you describe it?
It was very quick. That afternoon, it was kind of humid. You hear thundering, rumbling off in the distance. And the fellow that resuscitated me, Gene DeGear, he was a well driller, and my brother worked for him. So when storms threatened, they had better get that derrick down. And so Gene drove in the driveway to let my brother off. And talk about timing. Just then, my other brother Paul came up from the barn. A cow had just had a calf. And Gene always bought a calf from my dad every fall. Gene started backing out the driveway. My brother Paul yelled, "Hey, Gene, your calf was just born." Gene said, "Well, hey, I guess I better go see my calf." So we all went out to the barn lot to see the calf. And I have no explanation for a lot of things that happened, but it was just a very strong feeling came over me that I needed to get away from everyone. I started toward the house, and I was about 75 feet from the house. My mother said she didn't know why, but she came out on the porch, and I was about 6-7 feet away from an elm tree. And it was just a tremendous crack of thunder. I'm a little hearing impaired on this side because of it. And my mother saw the bolt come down that tree. It came off the tree, and she said for a moment it was like I was in like a blue-white cocoon. And I was just ready to say, wow, that must have been close. And I felt a lot of heat. And I knew in a split second, this is it. And I didn't even recall hitting the ground. I mean, it was, and how this can happen, I don't know. But yeah, your life really does pass before you. It's just like 1,000 things went through my mind in a split second, and knew that this was the end of my life.
Do you have any recollection of the 10 minutes?
I do.
What was that like?
It's kind of tough to talk about. I was 14 at the time. I was 21 years old before I could talk about this. I couldn't put into words what I'd experienced. I don't know what the time elapse was from the time I was hit until it was like I was passing through a corridor. It's like they were walls. There was no ceiling or roof. It was just like brilliant blue sky. It wasn't that I was walking. It was like I was just floating. In the distance, it was a brilliant yellow-white light. And as I got closer, I started seeing people. And suddenly there was my grandmother who had passed 3 weeks before. And my grandmother was 89. When she passed, she had like 5 heart attacks in 4 days, so she was looking pretty bad when she died. But now she was just radiant and just beaming of happiness and health. And Grandma greeted me, and behind her were many other friends and relatives that had passed. And it was like a thought transfer. It wasn't like my grandmother was verbally saying, Floyd, to stay here, I'll go with you to the light. And then it seemed like I started drifting backwards away from everyone. And then it was just like, it was like waviness, and they all faded away. And next thing I knew, I heard Jean say, come on, Floyd, breathe again. Come on, you can do it. And I thought, if I don't breathe, he'll let me go. I mean, I had a happy childhood and everything, but what I experienced, I did not want to come back. But the diaphragm takes over, and then I was breathing on my own, and yeah.
So you felt drawn to the light?
Yeah.
Wow. What other feelings?
I had never heard that before and never read it before, but that's what I experienced.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Wow. So you came back to us for a few more years.
Well, 62 more. Yep.
What was your perspective on life like after that event?
Not afraid of death. Yeah, not afraid of it at all. I've had a few near-death experiences since then. When I was 23, I was the only survivor of 3 in a head-on collision. One of those killed was my best friend. It was a head-on drunk driver out on Meridian Road, September 27th, 1971. Had a heart attack when I was 61. So, but I say, not afraid of death. I just know that, one day that will happen, and I know where I'm going.
What was it like losing a friend in a head-on collision like that? Must have been really tough.
Yeah, that was Doug Owens from up on Bombay Road. He was 19. I was 23 at the time. We were taking his car to a body shop over in Breckenridge, and his girlfriend, my girlfriend, and I, we were kind of a foursome. And
it's a hard one.
Yeah. Died in my arms. Yeah, things like that. It takes a long time to get over. Maybe you never really get over it, but yeah, it was really, really a tough time.
Well, let's talk about some happier times.
Okay.
Sorry about that. It's just very interesting parts of your life, or monumental parts of your life. They're very important. What did you do in your 20s?
My 20s, I started at 18 working for the Earl Chambers Company out on Eastman Road. With my earnings, I was able to pay my way through my first year at Delta. And finished that first year. I was so broke, I didn't have a dime to my name, so that I'll take a year off and get some money saved so I can go back. Excuse me. And at the Earl Chambers Company, the foreman, he was 65, planning to retire. And there were 35 men there. And some days I wondered, why is he jumping me on all these different jobs? And one day on this machine, and anytime something broke down, Floyd, come here. Troubleshooting and show me how to do repairs. Well, then I soon realized he was grooming me to take his job. So I guess I was almost 20 when he retired, and I became foreman over 35 men. And the owner of the company, Mike Chambers, he said, well, Floyd, we'll give you a few weeks, see what you can do. Well, the previous foreman, when you was put on the job at 8 a.m., you were there for 8 hours, other than the lunch break. But my first day as foreman, 12:30, it's time to start up. I moved the guys on all different jobs. And I gave them praise when we needed to hurry a job for really working hard to get it done. Into 2 weeks, Mr. Chambers said, Floyd, I don't know what you did, but we broke all-time production records this week. What did you do? So I shared my strategy. Well, when I was 23, I thought I can't own this business, and I really wanted to pursue my medical interest, business interest. So I applied, went to work at Midland Hospital as a surgical technician, work emergency and surgical post-op, eventually specializing in orthopedics. That was an avenue to work with instruments and bones, much more attractive than internal surgeries. And I also, then that year, I opened 1971, and I was, 23, wanted to go into business. And one day I was looking at an opportunity magazine, and I saw an advertising for the Von Schrader carpet cleaning and upholstery cleaning equipment. And I thought, that could be a good business. I don't know why, but I like to clean things up, make them look clean, nice. So anyway, I did some research, found out there was only really one company in Midland. The other, he was retiring. Thought that field's wide open. So I ordered the equipment, had a lot of jobs lined up even before the equipment arrived. And boy, the first week I made over $500. That was in 1971. That was some really good money. And it just boomed. And so eventually I started hiring some help. And but then I was working at the hospital and running the business. And then I started, when I was 20, then I had bought 40 acres next to our farm, and then I ordered the biggest, most expensive mobile home could be built. Moved it onto the property when I was 19. Of course, that was then my home. And then I began picking up used mobile homes, renovating them and selling, and eventually started buying mobile homes in Midland parks, doing the same, and then buying conventional housing. And I think over the years, I probably owned 35 homes. So that extends a little beyond my 20s.
What made you decide to get into real estate investing as a part of your overall income streams and business acumen?
Well, I always liked the real estate industry. I don't know why I never got my real estate license. But like initially taking a mobile home that maybe needed painting, clean up, fix up, and employing my abilities and seeing one look almost like new again, turning it around and making good money, and then eventually getting into conventional housing, doing the same, and then to start renting them out. And I've had a very successful rental career of about about 55 years. Had rentals. In fact, one was a 5-unit just a couple blocks from here. I really liked having the rentals. I took really good care of them, took really good care of my residents. I only did one eviction in all those years,
Wow.
and it was kind of my fault. Interviewed a young fellow that wanted to rent from me. My gut feeling was telling me no, no, no. But I thought, I'll work with this guy, I'll mentor him, help him turn his life around. It didn't work. And I had to do an eviction, which was not a fun experience, but that was the only one in all these years.
That's pretty impressive for 55 years of rentals.
Well, as I've always said, even all the 8 years I was president of the Landlords Association here, screening.
Yeah, I think I remember being involved in that while you were there.
That's right.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
All right, let's go back to your late 20s, early 30s. What was next for you? Were you working in the business or doing the medical stuff?
Doing both. Yeah, I ran the business till 1998. I sold it to an employee for $35,000. He ran it for several years, and then he turned it over to his son. And
That was it.
that was kind of the end of it. Continued on, in real estate and the hospital. I retired out from there in 1998. And I know the day that I sold the business, I thought, oh my gosh, I'm unemployed. What am I going to do? I've been working ever since. A lot of volunteer work and, of course, flipping houses. And, of course, I still had the rentals. So, just getting involved in especially the Historical Society and other organizations, just, staying very active, very involved. Giving of myself, doing a lot of mentoring of young individuals, guiding them into getting into real estate and investing in rental property. And as I share with them, it's not for the faint of heart anymore. You really need to know the business before you step into it, because tenants have all the rights. So
Let's talk about the Midland County Historical Society. You joined that in 1998.
March of 1998.
What was Midland like in 98? How would you describe it?
It's grown some, not a whole lot. Midland has always been a good place. I've traveled all over the world, and even times I've been in Europe hosting Titanic conventions and staying with friends there. And after about 10 days, even though I'm having a wonderful time, I'm ready to get back to Midland, Michigan.
Tell us about the Titanic conventions in Europe.
Well, I've been a Titanic buff for 70 years. I was about 77 years old. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. She was a real history buff, and one day I was out helping her in the garden. I said, well, Grandma, tell me a story. She says, well, now what haven't I told you? She said, back in 1912, over in England, they built the biggest, finest, greatest ship in all the world. And on its maiden voyage coming to America, it struck an iceberg and sank. And over 1,500 people perished. And that was roughly the population of Midland at that time. And she said, it's all everybody talked about for weeks. Well, after that, I did some research. 1982, I joined the Titanic Historic, actually 1973, I joined the Titanic Historic Society based in Massachusetts. 1982, I drove to Philadelphia to attend the 70-year anniversary of the Titanic disaster. Met 5 survivors, and then I was really hooked. 5 years later, I organized and hosted the 75-year anniversary convention. and that was held in Wilmington, Delaware. We had 9 survivors attend, and eventually I met and knew personally 14 survivors and could hear all their stories firsthand of that night. That convention, we had 1,100 Titanic enthusiasts attend, and it was a real challenge. That's why I say these few gray hairs I have, that's where I got them.
What what were some of the firsthand accounts that are interesting? I'm sure they must have been fascinating to hear.
One of the most fascinating was by survivor Eva Hart from Southampton, England. Eva was 7 years old at the time, and she related in February 1912, she came home from school, and her mother was sitting at the kitchen table. Her mother was crying. Eva said, "Mommy, what is wrong?" And her mother said, "Oh, your father's got this crazy notion. He wants to sell his business and go across the Atlantic to Canada and join your uncle in business there." And Mrs. Hart said, "I've just got a bad feeling about it." Well, as the weeks went on, Mrs. Hart begged and pleaded with her husband that they not take this trip, but he was adamant that they would go. 3 days before they were to sail, Eva said, "My father came in the door. He was all excited, said to my mother, 'Something wonderful has happened.' She said, 'You canceled the voyage?' 'Oh, no. He said, 'We were booked on the ship Philadelphia, but because of the coal strike, our passage has been transferred to this wonderful new ship, the Titanic. Certainly you'll want to go now.' And Eva said, my mother said, 'Oh, no. I feel much worse about going now.' Well, he was adamant that they would go. So on the morning of April 10th, they boarded the Titanic, and on the way to their stateroom, they ran into one of the ship's officers, and Eva said, my mother stopped him, asked him about location of life jackets and life-saving equipment, because she said, 'I've got a bad feeling.' And he said, 'Aye, Mom, you needn't be concerned. Don't you know God couldn't, even God couldn't sink this ship?' And Mrs. Hart, Eva said, my mother turned pale. She grabbed the handrail, looked like she was going to faint, and she solemnly stated, 'I will never reach America in this ship. Something is going to happen to this ship. It'll happen at night. So I'm going to stay up at night and I'll sleep in the daytime.' So Eva said, as it was, next morning, said the three of us had breakfast. My mother had stayed up all night. And so, said Father and I would tour the ship while my mother slept peacefully away. So that went on the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. Sunday, it was warm. People were out strolling the decks. But then late afternoon, it turned cold because they were getting into the proximity of ice off the Great Banks of Newfoundland. And that night, Eva said my mother was really agitated, and she was so sure something was going to happen that night. Said she remained fully dressed, laid out Eva's clothes on the bed for morning, and Eva said, Father and I got into our bunks, went to sleep, and at 20 to 12, said later my mother described it as though someone just drew a giant finger down the side of the ship, this grinding scraping of the iceberg. Said Mother immediately wakened Father and me, implored Father to get up, get dressed, something has happened. Said Eva, said my father was most cross about being awakened in the middle of the night, some crazy notion by his wife, but he got up, got dressed. He went out to investigate. Meanwhile, Eva said Mother got me up and was putting all these stockings and dresses and clothes and coats and scarves and everything on me. And Eva said, Mommy, are we in New York already? And her mother said, no, we're still out in the ocean. but we have to leave the ship. And Eva said, I couldn't understand. Said pretty soon Father came in, said he was very pale, took his coat off, put it on Mrs. Hart, said, come with me, escorted them up to the boat deck over the railing into lifeboat number 10. And he stood back. They started to be lowered, and Eva said, I was scared to death, said it was dark, it was so cold, and we were swung out and to be lowered 70 feet down the side of that ship. Said we started to be lowered, and Mother said to my father, what about you? And he said, the danger is over. You'll be back on board, so I'll see you at breakfast. We were lowered away, rowed out away from the ship, and Eva said, I remember seeing that the bow was down, the stern was high in the water, and said I never took my eyes off that ship, and I watched the bow go under, and said there was enough light, you could see the propellers glistening. And I asked my mother, Mommy, how is the ship going to go anymore? So my mother didn't answer. We watched, and then the ship broke in half. Bow went down, stern settled back on the surface. A couple minutes later, at 2:20 in the morning, stern went under, and she knew it. She said, never see my father again. Yeah, it was quite a story, and she said, of course, the Carpathia arrived an hour and 10 minutes later. We got on board the Carpathia, got into New York on Thursday evening, and said my mother immediately booked passage on the ship Celtic to go back to England, and she never had another premonition. It was a once-in-a-lifetime thing.
Wow.
Yeah, I never tired of hearing Eva share that story.
How did that affect her in her life?
Well, she went on. She became a magistrate, and she never married. Yeah, she said, it was very sad losing her father because she loved her father very much. And she remained close with her mother. Her mother died in 1929, 17 years after the Titanic disaster. But Eva really didn't talk about it much till later life when individuals like myself found her, and it was true for most of the survivors. They just didn't talk about it until later in life, when people like myself met them, revered them, developed good friendships. And I had the pleasure of knowing 14 of them and hearing all their stories. Every story was different. I asked one survivor, Edwina McKenzie from California. She was 28 when she was on the ship. I said, well, Edwina, your story is so different than, name different survivors. She said, well, Floyd, it's like if you're in a big city, the ship was almost 900 feet long. You could be here in your home, and 700-800 feet away, there could be a calamity going on, and you may not even know about it. Same with on the Titanic. Depends where you were, of what you experienced, what lifeboat you got in, when you left the ship. So that makes sense.
Were any of those survivors crew?
Yes. They were roughly 705 survived, and 324 were crew.
So half the survivors almost were crew.
Yes.
Out of how many total passengers? Over 2,500?
2,223.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So they took care of themselves?
Well, a lot of them manned lifeboats. And, when they had a chance to go, it was to be women and children only. But surprising, the number of men that actually survived, in addition to crew. Pretty much all of, not all, most of first-class passengers survived. men. Many of them did not. They chose to stay on board.
But they had the first right to leave because they were the first class?
Yes.
That's
Mhm.
interesting, huh?
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a story, and the interest has taken me all over the country. I put together a presentation, gosh, probably close to 50 years ago, and I've added to it since. I've done that presentation all over Michigan, nearby states, Canada. And in 2021, I was asked to do the presentation for the European Titanic Society. So I agreed. It was on the phone with the president of the group. I agreed to do it, and he said, but Floyd, it has to be done in German. Oh, okay. So I did know some German, but I called a retired German teacher here in Midland, Edith Anders, and told her the situation. She said, well, Floyd, come on over. So I got to her house. She said, okay, I want you to stand there in front of the fireplace and do your full presentation. She had a tape recorder going, recorded the whole thing. And a few weeks later, she called me. I went over. She had listened to it, she typed it, and spoke it at the same time into the recorder.
Wow.
So I could read it and hear it at the same time. So I went through that many times, and June 24th, 2001, at Stuttgart, Germany, I was up in front of 100-plus people, introduced, and I thought, yeah, this is kind of crazy. I've never been schooled in German, and now I'm doing a 1-hour presentation in front of over 100 people in German. Afterward, so many said, Floyd, your German is perfect. How did you learn German so well? But yeah, but I've developed, great friendships with many people in Switzerland and Germany, and I've been over 8 times. Always had a wonderful time there. I just couldn't ask for a better time.
Last question for you.
Yeah.
What is your favorite memory out of all these experiences you've had?
Oh, my. Wow.
Or one that comes to mind?
Boy, there are just so many. I guess meeting, just a lot of notable people. One of my favorite was Elzire Dion, mother of the famous Dion quintuplets. She was like a second mother to me, and I just loved the lady. I always treasured all the times with her and of course, with her husband, Oliva Dion. She was regarded as the most famous mother in the world.
This is quite a story. Tell this story quick.
Oh, my. Well, May 29th, 1934, at a log farmhouse near the village of Callender in Corbeil, Ontario, Oliva and Elzire Dion, parents of 5 children. Mrs. Dion was expecting her 6th, but suspected it was going to be twins. And in her 7th month of pregnancy, she went into labor with 2 neighbor ladies in attendance. At 4:10 that morning, the tiniest, bluest babies the midwives had ever seen made her arrival. That was Yvonne at 2 pounds 6 ounces. Second one arrived 10 minutes later. That was Annette, 2 pounds 3 ounces. And the midwife exclaimed to Oliva, who was in the kitchen, firing up the wood stove for more hot water. He said, "You've got twin girls." He said, "Well, we kind of expected it was going to be twins this time." 10 minutes later, "Oliva, you've got 3 girls, triplets." Never heard of anybody having triplets before. Well, Dr. Defoe arrived, and he delivered Emily and Marie. And when the midwife told Oliva it's 5 girls, he just couldn't imagine. He stepped into the bedroom, and The five, they had them laid out on the bed. They ranged 1 pound 10 ounces up to 2 pounds 6 ounces. The midwives were concentrating their care on the 5 babies. The doctor was concentrating his care on Mrs. Dion as she was near death. Fortunately, she did survive. But Dr. Defoe told the midwives, "You're wasting your time. That biggest one might live till tonight. The rest will be dead by noon." Well, touch and go over the following weeks, but they had the attention of the world. The media came by the hordes, promoters. When the Quints were 2 months old, the Canadian government saw big bonanza, and they forced the parents to give up custody because the government was providing the nursing staff, the shipments of mother's milk, paying the doctor, and the government said, "You surrender custody or we let them die." So the parents had no choice. They surrendered custody. A hospital building was hastily built across the roadway. The Quints were moved there when they were 4 months old. Following year, tourists began coming by the thousands. It was estimated over the subsequent 9 years, 3 million people went there to see the Quints. The government put them on exhibit, made an estimated $500 million off the Quints. Parents fought the government for 9 years before they finally regained custody. And, of course, the Quints had been raised as royalty, and then they were united in a big new home with the rest of their family, their farm family. Well, you unite royalty with farm kids and a farm family, it just doesn't work too well. When the Quints turned 18, they had a lot of money, had been banked for them. They left home, went off to Montreal to college. When they were 20, Emily suffocated in an epileptic seizure. An estimated 5,000 people attended her funeral. 3 of the Quints got married. Between 3 of them, they had 10 children, 1 set of twins. When they were 36, Marie died. 67, Yvonne died, and there are 2 left, Annette and Cecile. They turned 90 in May. Biggest story of the 1930s other than the Great Depression.
And how did you get to meet them? Your sister was their nurse?
Yeah, a relative of my family was the nurse, Yvonne LaRue. She was called in the first day. She took care of them for 2 years. And so I grew up hearing all about them. So when I was 18 and finished that first year of college, a friend and I decided to go to Canada fishing, and just for a vacation. And I thought, I want to go see what might be left of all this. Well, just by a stroke, a real good stroke of good luck, I was able to meet the parents. And they invited me into their home, I guess because I was a farm kid and they were farmers. We became very close friends. I enjoyed a wonderful friendship with the parents and their non-Quint siblings. I only met the Quints at their father's funeral in 1979. That was the only contact I ever had with them, because they were totally estranged from the family. Very, very sad story, and what government greed can do to a modest country family.
Well, Floyd, thank you for being on the Talk Midland podcast.
My pleasure.